In this devlog, I decided to do something different. Basically, I'd like to record like how I would create an application from scratch, a web application from scratch. And the purpose for this is to be able to learn something new. I decided to commit into learning something new every day as much as possible in order to better myself as a developer and hopefully learn something useful from my current projects. So the thing that I'd like to take a look at now is the new Rails version that was released last year, Rails 6. And it's interesting for me because most of my projects, my web application projects, are based on Rails, Rails 5 in particular, which currently uses the asset pipeline via sprockets to manage JavaScript, CSS, compile them, and deploy them in the system. Now for Rails 6, it actually took a different route. It now uses Webpacker by default. So if I were to, although Sprockets is still available, but if I were to transition to Webpacker, I'll have to learn like how to actually use it. Now I have used Webpacker in the past, mostly for React-based applications, as well as using, or at least for my recent projects, using Webpacker to extract third-party JavaScript libraries from npm and put them in my project via npm as well. So I'd like to see how Rails provides this infrastructure for JavaScript and learn how to integrate it with my project. And the project I'll be doing is to manage my personal finances, starting off with a basic accounting system, which I'll call Bookkeeper. So I'm now in Rails version 6, and we'll need Node for this as well as Yarn. So I already ran this earlier, but essentially I'm now running Node version 12.14. And the way I installed Node is I've used this tool called NVM. Right, so I planned this video as more of a sort of a log for my own personal use to see or to indicate what I've learned in this new technology, and hopefully if someone else finds it useful, then it's good as well. All right, so I use NVM to install Node in my development environment. If you're familiar with RVM for managing different Ruby versions, NVM works the same way. So you're able to manage different Node versions. And for the longest time, I've been using Node version 8.11, if I'm not mistaken. And when I tried Rails 6 out for the first time yesterday, it was actually looking for a specific Node version number. So instead, I upgraded to the latest Node version. But using NVM, you can actually list all the remote Node versions that you can install. Right, so in this case, I'm using 12.14 by default, and you can say something like nvm use 12.14 -- default to make it the default node for your setup. So I actually ran this yesterday, and you'll also be needing Yarn. So I noticed that I couldn't run the Rails 6 project, if Yarn wasn't present in your path. So to install Yarn, simply say npm install Yarn. -g, or rather npm install -g yarn to install Yarn as a global package in your setup. Okay, so now that we have Node, Yarn, and of course Rails 6 working, we can now start a new project. Now I'll name this project Bookkeeper. Database equals PostgreSQL. Right. Right, so it by default ran this command webpacker install. See if I can capture that. There you go, Rails webpacker install, which gives us a webpacker.yml config. Now, I'm not too familiar with Webpacker, the nitty-gritty of Webpacker, but hopefully with this video, I'll be able to take a look at its technicalities and see how it essentially works. I did use Webpacker before. For example, in one of my projects, I have a Webpacker config.js in the root of my directory, and Essentially, the way I saw this is that it's a way to compile or to package various JavaScript files. As you can see, I have a lot here, mostly custom JavaScript files that I sprinkle throughout my my Rails application. Okay, so I want to see how different it would look like for Rails 6. Okay, so with that, well, that's setting up. Okay, let's take a look at what it generated for us. Bookkeeper. Oh, no, not that. Bookkeeper. Okay, so I believe I did not put it in my workspace. Okay, so just move that to my workspace. Okay, I like to keep all projects in a folder called workspace. Right, so one striking thing I noticed was the difference between the way it organizes its JavaScript file. So in an old Rails project, or in a Rails 5 project prior to Rails 6, JavaScript was kept under app assets JavaScripts. Right? So this is for a different project, but for a Rails 6 based project, you don't have the JavaScripts directory under assets. Rather, we now have a JavaScript folder here with the application.js under a directory called packs. And when we open this up, it requires a bunch of, I guess, modules or directories. In this case, channels. It requires channels, turbo links, as well as Rails active storage and UJS. So maybe the first, okay, and it also includes node modules directory, okay, where it will install all the JavaScript packages that were downloaded via npm. Okay, we also have a package.json. Here we go. Okay, so every time we download a JavaScript library via Yarn, then it essentially registers in this package.json file, which, coming from a Rails background, works the way I see it, is it works just like a gem file, because it lists all the dependencies of your project, in this case the dependencies, the JavaScript dependencies, and stores them inside a directory called node modules. Okay, it also has a yarn.lock file, because since we're using yarn instead of npm, I believe it will lock the version, current version, similar to gemfile.lock. So there are some similarities on how Webpacker handles the different libraries that you might want to include in your project. Okay, so let me try something. Let's just create a simple page. Root to pages index. Okay, I believe for the most core of the Rails application, it's still the same approach. In terms of MVC, we still have a controller, wherein we extend application controller. And we have our method index that will, by default, look for a view under the views folder. Let's create a directory here called pages, and let's create index.html.brd. And let's just put some HTML here, hello world. Now what I'd like to do is, okay, just close this other project, probably reference it later on. Okay, so we don't have a database yet, so let's see. Alright, so we don't have a database connection yet. So we have to edit our database.yml file. And I guess when bootstrapping a project, the only default thing I leave at database.yml will be the name of the database for the various environments. So for example, development will have bookkeeper underscore development, for test, bookkeeper underscore test, production, bookkeeper underscore production. However, for the username and password, I'd like to keep it as an environment variable. So any other developer that would want to work on this project should set his or her own environment variables. Essentially, I'll have bookkeeper, database username, and I put it usually in the default. So every environment would extend this by default, and they can choose to override it in the case of let's say, for the production environment. Okay, aside from that, one thing I also noticed is that at least for Ubuntu-based distributions, the default Postgres installation doesn't work by default with the Rails. You often have to set host to localhost. Okay, but in order for it to work, so in this case, I'll have the host also as an environment variable. In this case, this would be host. And to set up these environment variables, my go-to gem for that will be .env Rails. Okay, so what .env Rails does, okay, it's getting a bit slow here. The internet connection is not that good. But essentially what .env Rails does, I know I have it installed in my current gem set. Let's take a look at the gem file here, the project. So I'll just say gem.env Rails. So what this gem does is that it provides a file called .env, or you can set up a file called .env that allows you to set up the different environment variables that are needed by your application. So in our case, I need to set up 3 environment variables: bookkeeper database username, database password, and database host, which I have in my root directory right here, .env. Okay, so make sure that I have the values set up there. For my username, I just use developer, and for the password, simply password. Right. Okay, another usual thing that I do for bootstrapping a new project is that I create dist files. And the idea for this is that the dist files will be committed to the repository, but the actual file will be ignored. So in this case, the file that I want to keep on a per developer or per deployment setup will be .env, and the template will be based on .env.dist. So as you can see, they have the same exact structure, and each developer that's working on this project will have to provide his or her own .env. So let me just add that to git ignore, and that should be good. All right. Now let's try to run the server again. Close this. Alright, so now we have our hello world. Now the first challenge for me to do is that I would want to include, rather, if the third-party JavaScript or CSS assets are found via npm, then I'd use that instead of downloading the actual file and manually putting it in my application. So I did some preliminary reading, and we can do that. And I'd like to see how we actually do that via Yarn and integrate it to our Rails 6 project. So let me see. Let me just do a quick search here. Let's say I want to include Bootstrap, Yarn, Rails 6. Let's see how we integrate that. All right. Okay. Go Rails. Okay, from Go Rails. Right, so we use Yarn and say something like Yarn add Bootstrap. I believe if we don't have the actual version, it might download the latest one. Oh, jQuery, okay, I still use jQuery, and popper.js. Right, so let's follow this tutorial by Sean Wilson back in March 2019. Hopefully it still holds true. Okay. So I'll do that. I'll say yarn add bootstrap jQuery and popper.js. Now, I believe if we do this, it would install in the package.json file. So let's see. Okay, there we go. We have jQuery, we have Bootstrap, and popper.js. Okay, so we know that it's inside somewhere here in Node modules, because this is where Yarn sort of drops the libraries. However, what we want to do is we want to integrate it to our application and use it in our application. So I guess here in step 2 it says that we have to add the following code in config webpack environment .js. Okay, so we have a similar structure, and I guess what we have to add is this part right here. Not sure exactly what this means yet, but if we check this out, we have a reference to Webpack and environment coming from Rails Webpacker. I guess the default Webpacker setup provided by Rails 6. Okay, we say plugins append. Okay, so what this seems to me, this sets up probably some global representation of the library. So $ for jQuery, jQuery for jQuery also, and popper for popper.js. And then it exports the environment as a module. Right. So let's see if this works in our system. Okay, so for step 3, we have to include, okay, so now we import Bootstrap from application.js for packs. All right, so let's do that. Under here, JavaScript, packs, application.js. So the way I understand it is that you can create various quote-unquote packs, and I guess they represent like modules that you deploy independently of each other, meaning you can have a page with a separate pack or module, and that JavaScript will just be applied to that page and no other pages, of course using the appropriate tags. But in a Rails-like fashion, if I'm not mistaken, in the layout file, we probably have, okay, there we go, JavaScript pack tag. Okay, so instead of the old JavaScript link tag, if I'm not mistaken, or include tag, this one instead includes a pack, right? So I guess part of the process is somewhere down the line, Rails 6 will probably compile this via Webpacker, and this particular method will include that final product as part of the and insert it to the page accordingly. Okay, let's see how that works next later on. But I assume that this one reads this file, and what we're going to do is we're going to import Bootstrap. Okay, so I guess it's configured by default to automatically look for Bootstrap under Node modules, as well as import src application.scss. Do we have src? Okay, we don't have src. Oh, we have to create a directory under src. So this one is relative, since we're inside application.js. This one is relative to the current directory, so I'll have to create a folder here called src and include application.scss. So, okay, just to make sure that it's actually working, let's say that in this scss file, okay, aside from custom rules, we import via Sass Bootstrap scss Bootstrap. Okay, semicolon. Okay, so the way I understand this, src application.scss. Okay, so the way I understand this is that Webpack takes in a JavaScript file, right? In this case, application.js, and whatever is required or whatever is included here or imported here will be compiled as a single file, which we drop inside our HTML page, which in this case is our layout file. So essentially, all other pages that extend this particular template will be able to include the application product from Webpack. And it also includes a custom CSS, here application.scss, which in turn imports Bootstrap scss Bootstrap. Now, I'm guessing that the tilde here represents the home directory or the path to Node modules. But how does it know to actually look in this directory. So let me just trace this, assuming that this one is smart enough to read the node modules directory. Let's see. Bootstrap should be somewhere here. Okay, there we go. Bootstrap under SCSS, and we should have bootstrap.scss somewhere. Okay, there we go. So it's sort of importing this directory. Okay, so if all that is in order, one thing that I can't grasp yet is how does Webpacker know where node modules is? How does Rails6 know where node modules is? Okay, so I believe this webpacker.yml that was generated when we first created the project would be able to tell us that. Okay, so I have a bunch of config files, but just by reading through it, the default is that the source path is from app JavaScript, and the entry path is packs, which I believe is our directory earlier, app JavaScript, and then we have packs right here. Public root path, public output path. I guess it will dump it to public packs, I guess. And that's how it probably reads it. Static assets extensions. Okay, I'll probably have to look up how it includes static assets, if it's the same as in the previous versions. So additional paths Webpack should look modules. For example, app assets or engine foo app assets. So we can also have resolve paths right here. Okay, so I think this is how Webpack would know where to actually find these files, in this case application.js, which works in conjunction with the tag that we've seen earlier. This one right here, JavaScript pack tag. Alright, let's see if this works. So we run the server. Should I refresh this page? Okay, so just look at the log files. Okay, so Webpacker is compiling what all the packs that were found. Essentially application.js. Here we go. And it also imported application.scss, and I'm assuming that it could also import Bootstrap because application.scss has Bootstrap, and we have it right here as confirmed. Okay, so that should be good. I guess this shows how Webpacker reads application.js, or any pack for that matter that we can include in a particular page. So let's say that I'd like to adapt the old style for organizing my custom JavaScript files. So for instance, let's say I want to have, let's say for pages, right? So in controllers I have pages controller, and I have an index here that's mapped to pages index.html.erb. Now usually what I do is I have something like a script here, type text JavaScript, and this is where I'd usually load my custom JavaScript, which I often have as a JavaScript include tag, something like this. And just to show the old style, I would usually put it in assets, JavaScripts, and then a directory corresponding to the same name as the domain, in this case pages. So it would look something like pages/index.js, and then I sort of include it as part of sprockets in the assets precompile configuration. But if we're doing it via Rails6, I'd still like to have this structure and probably have this as a pack, so to speak. Okay, so let me try that out. instead of JavaScript include tag, if we copy the one from application.js pack, or rather application.html.erb, it uses JavaScript pack tag. All right, so let's try that out. JavaScript pack tag. And assuming that this is relative to packs, I can probably have a directory and say pages/index without the .js extension. I'm not familiar with turbo links. Usually in Rails 5 I actually remove turbo links. But just to keep it similar to application, let's say turbo links track reload. Alright, so you have something like that just to set it up. And usually I have the entire JavaScript file as some sort of a command pattern or object-oriented JavaScript style. Okay, I'll show that in a moment. But essentially under the script tag, once everything is ready via jQuery, $document ready function, I usually call index.init and whatever options I hope to pass for this particular page. At least that's how I structure most of my JavaScript, custom JavaScript. So it's much cleaner, no mess. All you have to do is initialize it and it should run accordingly. Right. So the actual JavaScript, just by following the same pattern here, should be a pack under the directory pages index.js. That should give us this one. And nothing special here. Well, I would like to include jQuery. However, I think it's included globally thanks to the Webpack configuration, but let's verify it. Okay, let's verify it. So for the index.js file, I usually have something that looks like this. Var index equals an anonymous self-executing function that returns hash pointing to init. Okay, so I only expose the init function, which is also a function which in turn calls some basic methods, cache DOM, as well as bind events. Okay, so let's just do something simple here. This one will alert cache DOM, and this one will alert bind events. And of course, init will call cache DOM first and bind events accordingly. Okay, so that's basically my template for custom JavaScript that I sprinkle throughout my HTML pages. Okay, so some very basic JavaScript. And let's see if this one works. We have to restart the server. Let's see. Okay, so it hopefully compiles here, pages index. But nothing's happening. Nothing's happening. Let's see if it included it properly. Uncaught reference error $ is not defined. Okay, so it doesn't recognize the $sign here because we haven't included it doesn't recognize jQuery. I thought that jQuery was included by default as defined in Webpacker, or what was that file? Environment.js. Provide experts environment. Do I actually have to import jQuery? Okay, let's just do a quit Google, dollar is not defined for jQuery Rails 6. Okay. Okay, I did this part. Okay, so we have to include it globally. So for jQuery to get picked up, we have to export. So we exported dollar, but we have to include it in application.js, which is also included in the page. But will it be injected? Well, it is included in the page by default, so it should be injected accordingly. Okay, so let's try that out. We say window dot jQuery equals dollar, window dot dollar equals dollar. Let's have this nice aligned equal sign. I'm not sure if I have to restart the server. It's compiling it again. Okay, so now we have, we got rid of the error earlier, but we still have an error. Uncaught reference. Index is not defined. Okay, index is not defined because, let's check out our page. Should have been included. JavaScript pack tag. Okay, maybe it's a TurboLinks thing. Let me just remove TurboLinks first. Let me restart the server. Try to refresh this. Still have the same error. jQuery.js index is not defined. Is it actually this part? Right, so it's this one's causing the error. However, I already thought that I had it here as a pack. Usually this would work. Let's see if I don't have it within document. Index is still not defined. Okay, so why can't it read my index object? Let's see. This seems to be in order. Or does it expect that I return a hash of options? I think, since I'm passing this one. Hopefully that's it. No, still not working. Index is not defined. JavaScript pack tag pages index. It should have worked. Let's try to search it. Custom JavaScript Rails 6. I might have missed something. I'm reading through this last night. So I require it. Custom home. Okay, so add custom JavaScript within the app JavaScript packs directory. Alright, so if for some reason you don't want to create another directory, you could opt to add a custom JavaScript file within the JavaScript packs directory, then require files and application.js will require. For example, if you have a file in custom.js and app JavaScript packs, require it like the one below, and it will be compiled into the timestamp application.js. No, that's not what I want. I want it to be a totally separate JavaScript pack. Okay, so I have custom here. So this is what I hope to achieve. Okay, put it here, custom. And it should work. So this is the same thing I've been doing. However, index is not defined. Why is it not defined? Let's have something like, we have to export it. Export similar to what I did with application.js window, right? So I say something like window index, right, equals index. Okay. Really not a JavaScript person. Right, let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I have to do something like this, window.index equals index, for this to actually see what index is. So Webpacker does this thing, right, where I actually have to export it. There's probably a better way to do this. I have to search the forums for it, but at the very least I know now that I can include a JavaScript file. Okay, so just remove the alerts here. A custom JavaScript file the same way I did in my previous project and have it as a pack. The nice thing about this, I guess, is that if I have a custom CSS file, I can just import it the same way we imported application.scss from application.js. Okay, so I have to do this, window.something equals whatever we exported. In this case, I want to export the single variable representing all my JavaScript logic for my custom JavaScript inside this part. Okay, let me see if jQuery still works. So usually I had this earlier, document.ready function, and I had the index inside it. Okay, so it still alerts accordingly, so I guess that's still working. Right. So now I can create custom packs and have Webpacker compile it for me, but I have to make sure that it's exported accordingly in the window global variable. And let me see if I can also use jQuery, since it's also exported. Okay, so the idea here is that I'm not sure if, since I know application.js knows what jQuery is, and application.js is also included inside the HTML file here, JavaScript pack tag application.js. So the entire page knows what jQuery is, but does the individual JavaScript file know what jQuery is? Does it adapt it, or does it actually take, or can we actually use jQuery within this? Okay, let's try that out. Let's say that I have a button somewhere here. Okay, click me, and let's give it an ID, button click. Okay, and in my JavaScript file, index, okay, I usually do something like this, button click, have it as a global variable here, and in my cache DOM, I'd use jQuery, for example, to refer to it. And in my bind events, I'll have button click, usual typical jQuery stuff, on click, execute something. Let's say we alert button clicked. So the theory is, I want to know if jQuery still works within this JavaScript file, because I know it works in the old asset pipeline, but we actually have to also export jQuery again within this file in order for this file to know what the $sign is, which refers to jQuery. Okay, let's try to reload this. Okay, click me. Right, so we have an uncaught reference error alert. Okay, that's my fault. It should be alert. Okay, click. Okay, so it can read jQuery apparently. Okay, so no need to say window dot dollar equals dollar. So I guess this is nice, right? So I can define some global stuff here that might be used by all my custom JavaScript assets in application.js, right? And then for the individual assets, then we can use $jQuery, but I have to always keep in mind that I have to export it in window. For example, index should be equal to index for this particular file for a specific page. Right, so I guess that's the basics, I guess, of having Webpacker, or the default behavior of Webpacker via Rails 6. Okay, so there we go. Okay, before I leave, I make sure that I have a database. Okay, we just say Rails db reset. So this should run the configuration file and make sure that the database is actually created for us. Okay, so we have an error here. Okay, it's being accessed by other users because I have the server running. Right. Okay. Right, so I initially tried this out yesterday actually. So it dropped the previous database and we recreated that database for us. Alright, so now I guess I have a Rails 6 setup going. So the last thing I'll do is make sure that I commit this. So these are the files that are going to be committed. And okay, I'd like to ignore temp. Yes, I forgot to ignore that. Oh, but it's already ignored. Except keep, I think. Right, except keep. We're still storing keep. Hopefully. Are we? Ignore uploaded files. Right. Okay, so just set that up in my GitHub account. Okay, we need the device verification code sent in my email. Okay, there we go. Alright. Okay, let's create a new project. Let's call this Bookkeeper. Simple accounting system based on Rails. Create that repository. Okay, so very interesting. I do see myself transitioning to Webpack later on. First commit. Add git remote add origin. Make a point here. Let's push it. Okay, very interesting. To use Webpack and Yarn to manage different JavaScript assets. So now I have it right there, and that's it. Okay, that's my learning for today, and hopefully in the next devlog I'll get started on the actual business rules for the accounting system.